Hey friends. Tonight, we're slipping into a chapter of history that left its mark not through battles or kings, but through silence. Through emptied streets, shuttered windows, and the quiet, slow endurance of those who somehow stayed alive when everything around them was falling apart. This is the story of the plague survivors. Not the ones in legends or ballads, but the ones who woke up one morning to a village half empty. Who boiled their water, whispered their prayers, and watched the world get quieter, day by day. They weren't heroes. They were just there. Breathing. Waiting. Trying to hold on to something normal when nothing was. Welcome to Sleepful History, where the past unfolds slowly, like turning the pages of an old book by candlelight. There's no music here. No shouting. Just a soft voice, a dimmed room, and enough detail to carry you gently into sleep. If this calms you, or gives your mind somewhere quieter to go, leave a little like or a comment, and let me know where you're listening from tonight. It's always a comfort, seeing this soft little gathering from around the world. Now, take a deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let your room become your refuge. And picture a small house with a cold hearth. A garden overgrown. A single figure, wrapped in worn linen, standing at a window that hasn't been opened in weeks. They're not running, they're surviving. Tonight, we begin the story of what it meant to live after the Black Death, and it all begins with the silence that followed. You survived. Somehow, while the rest of your village coughed, bled, and collapsed into filthy blankets or shallow ditches, you kept breathing. You don't know why. Maybe it was the onion tied to your belt, or the herbs boiling under your window, or just dumb luck dressed up as divine mercy. But now it's the spring after the plague, and survival feels less like a victory and more like a sentence. Quiet, uncelebrated, uncomfortable. The air still smells of ashes, a little like smoke, a little like something left too long in a corner of the pantry, and it clings to your tunic no matter how often you beat the dust from it. The birds have returned, but they're hesitant, pecking half-heartedly at the frostbitten earth. No one's planting anything. No one's singing. The fields are mostly untended, furrows eaten over by grass and silence, because there's no one left to reap, and fewer still who remember how. Your hands, once stiff from labor, now feel aimless, unoccupied, and cold. You were never a scholar, but even you can feel that the rhythm of the world has snapped somewhere behind the clouds, that the usual certainty of sun and sow and supper has come undone. And no one seems eager to tie it back together. The village well is quiet now. Before, it was a gathering place. People came with buckets, gossip, hopes, complaints. But now, even water feels suspicious. The buckets sit untouched in corners, withered by mildew and time. The rope is frayed. The crank squeaks like a scream. You've started collecting rainwater off the thatch, not because it's cleaner, but because it hasn't passed through the same hands that touched a dozen dying mouths. Paranoia has become your new prayer, and each cautious ritual, scraping your boots, boiling your water, chewing dried herbs with names you can't pronounce, feels like a ward against something still lurking, still unfinished. You're not alone, not exactly. A handful of people remain. The smith, who no longer bothers to reheat his forge. The widow near the church, who stares too long at the wall. A few boys who think throwing stones at crows counts as education. The priest is gone. He died early, noble and foolish, tending to too many. His replacement is a pale lad from another town who recites his Latin so quickly it sounds like he's running from it. He doesn't know your names. He barely looks at your faces. He performs the rites with the indifference of someone folding linens. You don't work the way you used to. Not because you're lazy, but because the market is dead. Literally. Half the merchants never return from their carts. The others are nervous, ghostly, selling stale grain at discounts because they'd rather have someone eat it than watch it rot. Barter has replaced currency, eggs for thread, meat for candles, but most people have nothing to trade but fear. And fear, like flour, grows moldy when left in damp corners. You sometimes walk the perimeter of the village just to remind yourself where it ends, where the walls once stood proud and now crumble with ivy and neglect. On the eastern road, there's a pile of old shoes. Some say it's where they burned the bodies. Others say it's where people ran and never returned. Either way, you give it wide berth, even though there's nothing left but cracked soles and the ghosts of footsteps. At night you try not to think. That's when the coughs sound loudest, even if no one is coughing. That's when shadows look like figures and breezes feel like someone exhaling behind you. Your bed is rougher than before. The straw was never replaced. The mattress smells faintly of smoke and something else, something older. You pull your cloak tighter, even though you're alone in the room, and stare at the ceiling beams until your eyes blur. Sometimes you sleep. Sometimes you don't. But always, the silence is heavier than it should be. The kind of silence that suggests something listening. Food is strange now. The usual spices are gone, cinnamon, pepper, the fun things reserved for holy days. You eat what you can find, lentils that taste like dirt, onions that burn more than they flavor, bread that leans dangerously close to sour. Meat is rare. You don't trust it when it's offered. There's a new superstition that pigs are cursed, though no one can say why. Even salt feels like a luxury. You scrape it from the sides of old barrels and hoard it like treasure. The hunger doesn't gnaw, it settles. A dull emptiness that lives somewhere behind your ribs, as though you've forgotten how to feel full. And then there are the dreams. They don't make sense. Old faces in new places. Fires that won't catch. Songs sung in wrong voices. You don't talk about them, because everyone has them. Everyone's seen something they shouldn't. Bodies in doorways, mothers burying sons, priests mumbling over pits too wide for proper grief. No one wants to relive it. The plague may have passed, but it left behind a quiet fever in the mind, a slow erosion of joy. You tried to be thankful. You survived. But survival is slow, lonely, and not what the stories promised. Even the weather feels different. Rain is colder. The sun is less golden, more white and hard. The wind whistles strange tunes through the cracks in your home. You used to find comfort in the seasons, but now each change feels ominous, like a whisper from a world that doesn't care whether you live or not. There's no festival this year. No maypole. No midsummer bonfire. Just people waiting, aging, forgetting. You hear that in other towns, they've started building walls, not against people, but against memory. Covering over the graveyards. Burning old belongings. Trying to erase the plague like it was an ink blot on a sacred page. But it's not so easily scrubbed out. The bones remain. You carry a small pouch of dried rosemary in your belt, not because it helps, but because your mother once said it did. She didn't survive. You buried her with a coin in her mouth and a flower in her hand, though the flower withered before you reached the church. That's the thing about death. It never hurries, but it never forgets. It lingers. It infects not the body, but the rhythm of living. And now, every act, washing, walking, cooking, feels like a ritual performed in its shadow. You tell yourself things will return to normal. That someone will rebuild the school. That the mill will turn again. But normal has become a distant concept, like childhood or heaven. You hope for quiet, for peace, for some new rhythm. But for now, all you have is breath, brittle and uncertain, carried on air that still feels a little too heavy. And then, of course, there are the children. Fewer of them now, and the ones who remain seem stranger, older than their years, with quiet eyes and habits borrowed from watching too much grief. They no longer laugh in the old ways, no more chasing hens or shouting at the wind. They sit and listen, to nothing, to the sound of creaking beams or far-off crows. Some of them play funerals, stacking stones for grave markers and muttering nonsense rites while dragging sticks behind them in the dirt. You want to stop them, to teach them games that don't involve death, but you've forgotten the rules. The plague stole not only people, but traditions, rhythms, entire patterns of childhood that were once passed down casually, and are now just gone. You used to know how to carve toys from bark, how to whistle a tune on a bent reed. Now your fingers feel stiff and foreign, and every sound reminds you of a cough you once heard from behind a door that never opened again. The church bells ring less often now. When they do, it's rarely for celebration. There are no weddings. Few baptisms. Mostly tolls for those who died late, or for the unmarked anniversaries of something large and unspeakable. The sound of a single bell across the mist feels more like a memory than a signal. The fields beyond the church, once a place for gatherings and markets, now lie overgrown, tangled with weeds that even the goats avoid. A few stones mark where pyres once stood. No one speaks of them directly, but everyone glances that way when the wind changes. You yourself have begun avoiding that path, even though it's the shortest way to the brook. Something about the soil there feels wrong beneath your feet, loose, too soft, as if it might sigh and sink if you stood still too long. The animals are not quite the same either. Dogs no longer bark as they once did. Cats stare too long at empty spaces. Birds land only briefly, as if uncertain whether the ground still belongs to the living. Even the livestock seem subdued, as if some ancestral sense warns them that this world is not as it was. The cows refuse certain pastures. The chickens cluster near doorways, clucking low and nervous. You've begun to wonder whether they too remember, in some deep, animal way, the weeks when the air was thick with fire, smoke, and prayers. Whether the silence of the barns is a sign, or just your imagination turning inward too often. The worst part, perhaps, is the way time no longer obeys. Days pass, but they do not build. They stretch, bend, repeat. One Tuesday feels like another. The sun rises and falls, but it does not seem to matter when or how. You sometimes find yourself standing in the middle of a task, splitting wood, fetching water, and realize you don't remember beginning it. You live in a blur of repetition and hesitation, interrupted only by the occasional knock, the sound of distant shouting, or the heavy, muffled sob of someone behind a shutter. And yet the calendar insists that months have passed, that you have moved forward. But forward toward what? The old markers, feast days, saints' days, fairs, harvests, feel like relics from a world that no longer applies. The last festival was cancelled. No one even attempted to replace it. You wore your old clothes that day anyway, out of habit. They didn't fit quite right anymore. And still, there are rumors. They travel more swiftly than carts now, whispered at wells, muttered through doorways, carried by visitors with too wide eyes and voices lowered from too much grief. Some say the plague has returned to the east, or never left the south. Others say it has taken new forms, hiding in fabrics or spices. There are whispers of a village that disappeared entirely overnight. Of doctors who now wear red robes and burn incense not to heal but to mark the condemned. Of ships circling harbors, afraid to land, heavy with goods and death alike. You don't know what to believe, but you listen. Because listening these days feels like preparation, like defense. You've taken to marking days by different things now. The growth of the moss on the north wall. The way the light shifts through the hole in the eaves. The smell of the cellar when the wind blows from the east. These small signs feel more reliable than the words of officials or priests. You trust your senses, dulled as they are. You trust the heaviness in your bones more than the cheerful proclamations of men who never saw the inside of the death carts. The town crier, once full of official notices and royal decrees, now mostly calls about lost chickens and suspicious visitors. No one listens anymore, not really. His bell rings, his voice echoes, and people close their shutters out of habit. You remember the weight of the dead. Not just their bodies, but their presence. The way a room changed when someone passed. The way a road felt narrower when a cart full of limbs came rolling through, the driver silent, his scarf pulled tight across his mouth. You remember the burn of lye, the sharp sting of vinegar in your nostrils, the desperate, futile scrubbing of door frames and hands. You remember the color of the sky on the worst day, neither gray nor blue, but a kind of dirty bone white, like parchment left too long in the rain. You remember the smell of burned linen, the sound of someone humming while digging a grave, the flicker of torchlight over a wooden face carved too hastily for someone's father. These memories are not nightmares. They are embedded now, quiet and constant, like the weight of old injuries. But perhaps most quietly cruel of all is the new loneliness. Not the absence of people, you still see them, pass them, sometimes even share a word or two, but the absence of shared experience. Everyone suffered, yes, but differently. Some lost children. Some lost all. Some saw visions. Some never spoke again. And now, as you walk among them, you feel a distance not of miles, but of sorrows. There are those you used to laugh with who no longer look up. Those you used to avoid who now seem strangely calm. The social lines have blurred. The plague was no respecter of rank or reputation, and now the survivors seem stitched together not by friendship, but by mutual shock. A brotherhood of the bewildered. You've started to change your habits. You wake earlier, though sleep is rarely restful. You spend more time outdoors, even in the cold, as if movement might keep the memories from settling too deep. You eat slower. You speak softer. You avoid sudden sounds and sharp objects. You no longer rush to answer calls or greet strangers. You measure your days by effort, not achievement. Did you tend the fire? Did you eat something warm? Did you avoid crying? That counts. That's enough. The town is rebuilding slowly. A few new houses, a repaired cart, a cleaned well. Someone even tried to repaint the sign above the tavern, though the letters are crooked and the paint ran in the rain. There is talk of a new harvest, of hiring outsiders to help. You're not sure if this is hope or denial. But you nod along. Because sometimes pretending is the only way to begin again. You don't know if joy will return. You don't know if the stories they tell, the ones about how suffering makes us stronger, are true. But you do know how to breathe. How to boil water. How to wait, and so you do. Florence had always been a city of noise. Of bells ringing at odd hours, of footsteps on worn stones, of cloth merchants arguing over bolts of wool dyed too pale, of apprentices shouting from balconies while bread cooled in narrow alleys and cats fought over scraps beneath vendors' carts. It had a rhythm, unrefined but proud, a pulse formed by generations of craft, prayer, gossip, and gold. But when the plague came in 1348, the noise didn't stop all at once. It thinned. It stretched. It flickered like a candle in a drafty church, uncertain whether it would go out or flare again. First went the laughter in taverns, the long-winded sermons from fat priests, the singing of washerwomen beating linen at the river. Then the clamor of carts bringing grain from the countryside slowed, their drivers gaunt and hesitant. The markets no longer filled every corner of the piazza. The bells began tolling longer and deeper, not for festivals, but for the dead. And slowly, almost respectfully, the city became quiet, not in mourning, but in paralysis. Boccaccio watched this from behind shuttered windows, and through the faint scratch of his quill. He was not old yet, not wise in the way people expect from chroniclers, but he could see what others couldn't admit. The world was shifting. Not ending, but rebalancing itself in a way that felt both unnatural and inevitable. And Florence, for all its wealth and marble and bloodlines, could not bribe death. He described it later in words that felt detached, like a man trying not to drown in the very memories he poured onto parchment. He wrote of mothers abandoning children, of lovers refusing to touch, of neighbors pretending not to hear screams from the next room. He wrote of bodies left at doorsteps, of mass graves dug with more haste than dignity, of priests mumbling final rites through cloth. But what he didn't say, what crept between his lines like mildew in stone, was the stillness. The city's soul, once loud and opinionated, had gone mute. The air tasted of lime, ash, and damp wood. The streets were cleaner than they had ever been, not from civic pride, but from the absence of feet. Even the pigeons seemed lost, circling empty rooftops, unsure where the crumbs had gone. Boccaccio did not escape. He endured. That was the difference. He lived through it, which is not the same as surviving. He walked the city after its worst days and felt the strange guilt of breath. Friends were gone. Patrons vanished. The university was shuttered. The press of humanity that once made Florence unbearable and brilliant now lived only in his memory. He saw buildings that once echoed with voices now filled with dust, altars unlit, fountains dry. And he did what men like him do, he wrote. Not laments, but fictions. Not to deny what had happened, but to create a space where grief could wear a different mask. The Decameron was born not as celebration, but as refuge. 10 young people fleeing the city, telling stories to distract themselves from a world that had cracked. He gave them tales of clever women, foolish merchants, lusty monks, not because these things mattered more than death, but because they mattered in spite of it. It was an act of defiance made quiet. What Florence became in those years was less a city and more a collection of unspoken rituals. People began leaving food on thresholds rather than handing it to neighbors. Coins were boiled before being exchanged. Funeral processions no longer marched but crept, brief, silent, watched only by the brave and the numb. The government, such as it was, issued proclamations in the square, but fewer and fewer gathered to hear them. Fear had not made people more faithful, only more cautious. The churches still functioned, but the pews were often empty, the incense burned heavier, as if to smother some deeper odor. Even faith, in that heavy Florentine air, seemed brittle. Those who had the means left early. The wealthy fled to their country villas, dragging with them servants, tutors, horses, and wine, thinking distance equaled safety. Some did avoid the worst of it. Others simply died surrounded by better furniture. The poor had no such luxury. They stayed, because they had nowhere else to go, because they believed they were already beneath the notice of the plague, or because they could not imagine Florence without them. Boccaccio saw this, too. He did not mock them. He saw the dignity in those who lit candles for neighbors, who swept stoops no one would visit, who whispered prayers in doorways thick with flies. These were not heroes. They were people who had lost the world and continued to walk through its husk. Time, of course, did not stop. Crops still grew sometimes. Rain still fell, though it felt colder. The Arno still flowed, though slower and more sullen, as if it carried too much ash. The city did not collapse. It limped. Painfully, awkwardly. Some shops reopened. Some markets resumed. The painters returned to their studios, but their colors had changed. The reds were darker. The saints more emaciated. The backgrounds more empty. A subtle shift in tone, as if the city's very pigments had absorbed mourning. Boccaccio, for his part, wrote on, not always of plague, but always under its shadow. Even his later works, more scholarly, more restrained, carried the echo of those silent streets. He had seen what could not be unseen, and though he tried to move past it, it followed him, like smoke in old cloth. There were children born after the plague who never knew what Florence had been. They grew up among the scars, thinking the wide gaps in family trees were normal, that the closed buildings had always been closed. For them, the Decameron was not a mirror, but a window, a glimpse into a vanished brightness, tinged with the faint odor of survival. Boccaccio lived long enough to see this generation come of age, and to feel the ache of knowing that they would not remember the bell towers full, the crowded taverns, the crush of voices rising over market stalls. They would know only the aftermath, the quiet. And so Florence changed. Not in a single moment, but in slow layers. The plague did not erase the city, but it redefined it. It turned it inward, made it cautious, gave it a quieter kind of pride. The grand parades grew shorter, the poetry more somber, the fashion less flamboyant. There was still beauty, still learning, still art. But always beneath it, the pulse of loss, measured not in tragedies shouted, but in names no longer spoken. And Boccaccio, old before his time, folded his memories into pages, layered fiction over truth, and gave the world a laugh so carefully constructed that most didn't hear the weeping beneath it. There were houses in Florence that no one dared enter for years after the plague had passed, not because they were cursed in any official sense, but because too many had died within them too quickly. The shutters remained closed, the doors warped with damp and age, and ivy crept along the thresholds as if trying to hide what lay within. Some believed the air inside these homes had not yet forgotten its purpose, that the dust in those corners carried memories of lungs that had stopped in the dark. So the houses stood, like teeth missing from a smile, silent reminders that survival did not mean return. Even as life resumed in other parts of the city, these places remained untouched, and people walked quicker when they passed by. Florence had become a landscape of absences, with streets that no longer led to gatherings, fountains that no longer echoed with laughter, and windows that never opened again. And all the while, Boccaccio continued writing, not because he hoped to fix what had broken, but because writing was the only thing left that felt certain, the only ritual that still held its shape. His world had once been filled with lectures, patrons, endless debates about philosophy and rhetoric and the nature of beauty, but now those conversations felt pale, like smoke from a candle too long ignored. In their place came questions no one could answer: why some died and others lived, whether God had turned his face, whether man could find meaning in a world where meaning had so casually evaporated. Florence was a city full of books, but even the libraries had fallen silent, their shelves covered in dust and fingerprints left by people who never returned. In the university halls, once alive with footfalls and hurried conversation, silence had become a kind of second architecture, shaping the air more than the stone did. Even when classes resumed, they did so with fewer students, softer voices, and an unspoken understanding that knowledge alone was not protection. Still, there were moments of resilience. A child sang once, beneath a window where no one had lived for months. A baker returned to his shop and opened the shutters, though he had nothing to sell but stale loaves and memory. A painter left a small image of Saint Sebastian on the wall of a building near the bridge, not commissioned, not signed, just left there like a prayer pinned to the mortar. These gestures were small, and easy to overlook, but Boccaccio noticed. He recorded such things not in his official writings, but in the corners of pages, in metaphors tucked into stories, in characters who found joy in wine even while the world burned. He was not naive. He had seen the carts, the pits, the robed men chanting to no one, but he refused to let those be the only notes in the song. And so he invented 10 young people, running from the city and from grief, and through their tales he constructed a space where humor, absurdity, and beauty could still breathe. In their laughter, Florence lingered. But the plague had also carved into the city's bones. The guilds were thinner, the apprenticeships fewer. Entire families disappeared from the records, leaving only surnames carved in stone or scrawled in brittle ink. Trade slowed, not only from fear but from lack of hands to load ships, press olives, stitch garments. The wheels of Florence turned, but with less force, less certainty. Political factions quieted, not out of resolution, but because too many of their members had died to argue. The city's famous rivalries and scandals, once shouted from rooftops and scribbled into sermons, gave way to something colder, more introspective. People became more private, more superstitious. Some clung harder to the church, others turned away entirely, trusting instead in charms, in strange relics, in whispered formulas passed from grandmother to granddaughter. Religion did not vanish, it simply became more fragmented, more personal, less grand. Boccaccio aged in this city that had grown quieter with him. He saw new buildings rise where old ones had crumbled, saw children play where ashes had once drifted in the breeze, but he never mistook growth for healing. The scar was still there, across the city's face, invisible to those who had never known what came before. He kept writing, but the urgency faded. The stories became more reflective, less playful. He taught, and he listened, and sometimes he sat in the cathedral and stared at the way light filtered through stained glass, not because it answered anything, but because it reminded him that beauty still existed, even if only for a moment. Florence never truly recovered in the way cities dream of recovering. It changed. It adapted. It learned to hold silence without flinching. New festivals emerged, but they were quieter, more measured. The parades returned, but with fewer trumpets. The art, though still magnificent, carried with it a weight, a knowledge that splendor could vanish. And while the world outside moved on, fought wars, traded silk, debated the stars, Florence held its quiet like a relic. A city of stone and memory, of cracked bells and careful laughter. And in that stillness, in the shadows of what had been, Boccaccio sat with his pen, and wrote a world that had already begun to forget itself. There was a certain rhythm to decay that Boccaccio began to recognize, a slow choreography of neglect that unfolded in predictable steps. First came the dust, the fine, pale coating that settled over doorways, books, market stalls. Then the rot, the smell of damp bread, of old wood left too long without repair. And finally, the forgetting, not intentional, not cruel, but quiet and inevitable. A name once spoken every morning now vanished from conversation. A shop's sign faded until no one remembered what had been sold there. A lane once busy with vendors now grown over with moss, as if the city itself wished to soften its own outline. In this fading world, Boccaccio understood that memory was not merely a record of what had happened, but a defense against vanishing. He saw the stories he wrote not as entertainment, but as scaffolding, keeping the shape of the city's soul intact while the walls cracked. Each tale, no matter how frivolous, was a stone placed against oblivion. Each joke, a small rebellion against silence. He watched as the Florentines who remained became more cautious in their joy. Laughter was shorter. Gatherings were smaller. Even weddings, once loud and lavish, became subdued affairs, quick, modest, with little dancing. The fine clothing still existed, but it was worn less often, as if opulence itself had become a kind of insult to memory. Wealth had not protected anyone after all. The plague had taken gold and rags with equal ease. So those who still possessed riches held them a little tighter, spoke a little softer, made fewer boasts. And when they commissioned art, it was different, not just in subject, but in tone. The Madonnas were more solemn. The saints more weary. The angels looked downward, as if listening for footsteps in the dust. Even the architecture reflected the shift, columns less ornate, windows narrower, spaces more inward-facing. Florence had not forgotten how to create, but it had learned to do so with restraint. Education returned slowly. The young came back to the schools, their voices hesitant in halls still echoing with absence. Boccaccio, invited to teach, found himself addressing students who had never known the city before its shadow. He taught them letters, history, the great authors of the past. But he also taught them how to look at silence, how to read the gaps between events, how to understand that what is not said can shape a world as surely as what is. He spoke of Cicero, of Dante, of Petrarch, but behind every lesson was a quieter one, that stories endure, not because they are beautiful, but because they hold something fragile that memory alone cannot carry. His lectures were not fire and thunder, but gentle, methodical, like someone carefully sweeping the dust from a forgotten mosaic. He did not seek to impress. He sought to preserve. Florence's economy, though wounded, limped back to life. New merchants arrived. Markets slowly refilled. The docks began to stir with activity, though the ships still bore the mark of loss. Reduced crews, unfamiliar flags, letters sealed in wax that no longer matched the names on the rolls. Trade resumed, but trust did not. Deals were quieter, contracts more cautious, partnerships forged less from ambition than mutual weariness. People did not believe in permanence anymore. They believed in necessity, in survival, in getting through the next winter without another whisper of sickness. The great dreams of empire and glory that had once filled Florentine speeches now sounded hollow. In their place were prayers for mild weather, for good harvests, for long nights without coughing. And yet, amid all this heaviness, there were flickers. Children, born after the plague, ran through the streets without knowing why their games felt louder than the city itself. A sculptor carved a lion from a single block of flawed marble and left it in the square, unnamed. A midwife lit candles in 10 windows on the anniversary of her daughter's death, and others followed without asking why. These gestures, small, unrecorded, and often misunderstood, were the real evidence that Florence, though altered, still breathed. Boccaccio noticed them, though he rarely wrote of them directly. He understood that some things must remain unspoken to retain their power. He aged alongside the city. His beard grayed. His eyes dimmed. He walked slower through streets he once knew by scent and sound, now changed, rearranged, blurred at the edges by time and rebuilding. He outlived friends, mentors, patrons. The students he once taught grew into men who barely remembered how still the city had once been. They spoke of progress, of rebirth, of a new golden age. And he nodded, but said little. Not out of bitterness, but out of awareness. He had seen what they had not. He had known a Florence that whispered more than it sang. And in his writings, in the folds of his stories, in the careful placement of laughter beside sorrow, he left behind the echo of that time, not to warn, not to judge, but to remember. When he died, the city did not weep in the streets. There were no parades. A few scholars marked the day. A few candles were lit. His books remained, of course. They were copied, read, misunderstood, reinterpreted. The Decameron would go on to be seen as a monument of literature, a mirror of human nature, a celebration of wit and resilience. But those who lived when he did knew better. They knew it was also a grave marker, carved in laughter, set in the middle of a silence that had once covered a whole city. Florence had survived, yes. But in Boccaccio's eyes, it had become something quieter, less a city of grandeur, more a vessel for memory. And perhaps that was enough. And so Florence moved forward, not triumphant, not healed, but present. Its bells rang again, its markets reopened, and its people remembered how to smile, though never quite the same way. In quiet corners, Boccaccio's stories lingered, not as escapism, but as gentle reminders that even in plague, even in silence, the human voice continues, not loud, not proud, but steady. Just enough. They did not look like healers. They looked like omens. Tall, stiff figures wrapped in dark, waxed robes, faces hidden behind curved masks that resembled the beaks of crows, their eyes covered by round, glassy lenses that caught the light like a cat's at night. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if the weight of their garments or perhaps the weight of expectation kept their limbs from behaving naturally. These were the plague doctors, not priests, not barbers, not scholars in the classical sense, but a new shape of man, stitched together from panic, theory, and ritual. They were hired not for their brilliance, but for their willingness. Paid by cities to treat the sick and count the dead, to enter spaces others fled from, to write down names and perhaps, if the stars aligned and the air held still, keep a few from dying. Their presence brought no comfort. Children cried when they saw them. Dogs barked. Some villagers crossed themselves or turned their faces away. But still, the doctors came, walking like strange birds through streets lined with lime and silence. The mask was not a joke. It was a theory made visible. Inside the beak, herbs, lavender, mint, myrrh, camphor, and sometimes even vinegar-soaked sponges, were packed tightly to purify the air. Miasma was the enemy, they believed, bad air, corrupted and foul, drifting through towns like an invisible fog of judgment. If they could filter it, perhaps they could survive it. The long coat, made of oilcloth or leather, was meant to repel bodily fluids, though it stiffened in the cold and creaked with every step. Gloves and boots sealed the ensemble, and a staff, carried not to examine but to prod from a distance, completed the image. The staff served many roles: a pointer, a weapon, a tool for lifting blankets or testing for movement. The plague doctor did not touch if it could be helped. Touch was dangerous. The eyes behind the mask rarely blinked. They could not. There were no eyelids in glass. These doctors were not all trained. Some were academics, yes, versed in the old texts of Galen and Hippocrates. Others were simply literate, willing, and unafraid of being alone with the dying. Cities signed contracts with them, agreements that outlined responsibilities and fees, promises of payment, lodging, food, and occasionally immunity from prosecution, should things go poorly. And they often did. These men did not perform miracles. They observed. They recorded. They lanced buboes with knives dipped in wine. They advised rosewater or crushed emerald or bathing in urine, depending on the decade and the theory in fashion. Their success rate was low. Their survival rate was not much better. But their presence became symbolic, proof that the city was doing something, that not all had been abandoned to fate. Even as fear spread faster than infection, the sight of a plague doctor gave shape to the crisis. He was not a savior, but a sentinel, standing between chaos and what remained of order. The origins of the costume are uncertain. Some say it began in France, in the mid-17th century, designed by a man named Charles Delorme. Others trace elements of it earlier, to the veils of Venetian physicians, to the herbal amulets worn by monks, to the soot-blackened faces of Moorish healers in Iberia. Wherever it began, the image solidified: the beak, the cloak, the gloves, the glass. It passed from city to city, drawn in manuscripts, etched in woodcuts, whispered of in towns that hadn't yet been touched. Children were warned to behave, or else the beaked man would come, not to heal, but to carry them away. The costume took on a life beyond its wearers, became part of the theater of death that surrounded every outbreak. And yet, for all its eerie flair, it was not entirely foolish. The layers did offer some protection. The mask did reduce exposure. The gloves did prevent contact. In a world without germ theory, without antiseptic, without even basic sanitation, this was as close to science as fear could get. What they saw would have broken others. Rooms full of bodies, some still twitching. Homes sealed from the outside, with signs painted in red to warn passers-by. Whole families huddled in corners, eyes sunken, skin marbled with purple rot. The stench, of decay, of sweat, of herbs attempting and failing to mask the truth, clung to them even after they bathed. They slept little. They wrote much. Diaries, death rolls, letters to city officials. Some described the symptoms in clinical detail: swelling in the groin and armpits, blackening fingertips, sudden fever, the telltale stigmata of infection. Others turned to metaphor, likening the plague to a devouring beast, a divine scythe, a second flood. And still others said nothing at all, letting their silence speak for the 1,000 they had counted, the 1,000 they had failed to save. In some cities, they were respected. In others, feared. A few were murdered, accused of bringing the plague rather than treating it. Superstition ran wild in the wake of so much death. Some believed the beak contained poison. Others thought the staff was enchanted. A plague doctor could be mistaken for a demon, especially in the countryside where education was scarce and terror was abundant. Their tools were simple: knives, leeches, poultices, but their image was complex. Half healer, half omen, they existed in a liminal space between medicine and myth. And when the plague receded, as it always did, they vanished as suddenly as they had come. The robes were folded. The masks stored away. The names forgotten, unless recorded in the margins of ledgers that no one would read again. But the masks survived, in art, in legend, in costume. During Carnival in Venice, you can still find them, worn not as warnings but as decoration. The beak has become theater, the symbol of plague turned into a flourish for celebration. It is strange how history repurposes its horrors. The uniform once worn by men walking through the ash of civilization is now a trinket sold in stalls, a glossy souvenir. But in the quiet hours of a museum, when the lights are low and the crowd's gone, the mask still feels heavy. It does not laugh. It does not forgive. It watches, the way it always has, from behind glass, from beneath the weight of centuries, from a time when medicine was theater, and death the ever-present audience. Some believe the mask itself held power. Not merely as a filter, but as a ward, a shape that frightened away death as much as it blocked infection. The long beak echoed birds seen as omens of plague, particularly the black-feathered carrion birds that lingered in cities too long uncleaned. In medieval thought, imitation often intersected with belief. To take on the form of something feared was to harness its force. The beak became not just a barrier, but a symbol of resistance, primitive, theatrical, but psychologically potent. It gave the doctor anonymity, detachment, a sense of becoming something beyond the fragile flesh beneath the cloak. Beneath the mask, he could dissociate from the cries, the rot, the stares of the doomed. He could become ritual, rather than man. And in a profession that saw more failure than success, ritual mattered. It gave purpose to helplessness, and structure to sorrow. Inside the beak, no standard recipe existed. Each doctor chose their own mixture of protective herbs and sharp-smelling ingredients, handed down in treatises or whispered by apothecaries. Dried roses, crushed cloves, wormwood, ambergris, camphor, resin, juniper berries. Each scent was chosen not only for its supposed medicinal virtue, but for its strength. The goal was not subtlety but obliteration, to drown the stench of pus and sweat and death in an overpowering bouquet of desperate faith. Some added vinegar-soaked sponges or rags soaked in wine, believing the acidity would burn away the invisible filth. Others included church incense, believing divine fragrance could banish evil air. The result was a scent both overwhelming and strangely comforting to those who wore it daily, like a talisman hanging from the face, declaring that the wearer had not yet succumbed. But scent was only one of many layers in the plague doctor's arsenal. Astrology, too, played its part. Many doctors, particularly those with academic leanings, charted planetary alignments before diagnosing or predicting outcomes. The position of Mars or Saturn was consulted with as much seriousness as the patient's pulse. Medical almanacs offered detailed instructions: avoid bloodletting during eclipses, burn sage on the Feast of St. Roch, carry emeralds on Wednesdays. There was a logic to it all, built on centuries of belief that the body was a microcosm of the heavens, and that the alignment of stars shaped the humors of men. And so, beside their surgical knives and vinegar cloths, plague doctors carried ephemerides and horoscopes. They treated flesh, but they also treated fate. Not all were charlatans. Some genuinely believed they were helping. Others knew they were not, but still chose to witness what others would not. There was a certain moral solitude in their role, a willingness to stay near the end, to speak when most had fled, to mark the hour of death in ink when no family remained to do so. These records became precious, not for their medical insights, which were often flawed, but for their human detail. Names, ages, occupations, last words, the date and location of the burial. In cities where cemeteries overflowed, these ledgers became the only proof that someone had once walked, worked, and wept. The doctor was not just a medic, but an archivist of collapse. And yet, they were not always welcomed. In towns ravaged by loss, suspicion flourished. Who were these cloaked strangers arriving from elsewhere, speaking little, touching nothing, smelling of burning and bitterness? Were they really here to help, or merely to observe? In the chaos of plague, every unfamiliar figure could be seen as a threat. Riots occurred. Doctors were sometimes chased from cities, their coats set aflame, their ledgers torn and trampled. The uniform meant protection, but also isolation. To become a plague doctor was to stand apart from society, to live outside normal rhythms of home and kin, to be seen but never embraced. They walked alone. They slept in borrowed rooms. They left quietly when the work was done. Some left writings, personal diaries, filled not with theory but with reflection. A few lines here and there about the sound of coughing under moonlight, about the strange quiet that followed the final breath, about the feel of holding a dying child's hand through a glove so thick it might as well have been stone. These were not meant for publication. They were written to hold back madness, to form a shape for sorrow. And centuries later, when historians dusted off these notes, they found not evidence of cure, but of witness, men who stood inside the storm and did not look away. Their legacy is not one of healing, but of presence. And in times of great suffering, that too is a kind of medicine. The instruments they carried varied by time and place, but none were comforting. Scalpels, small and rust-prone. Lancets for cutting open swellings. Cauterizing irons, heated over coals, meant to burn shut the pathways of infection. Glass vials of unidentifiable tinctures. Clamps, forceps, spoons. A case of dried leeches, still twitching when warm. There were also objects of more symbolic function, holy medallions, rings set with stones believed to absorb poison, small crucifixes tucked inside the lining of their coat. The bag they carried was heavy, not only with tools but with implication. To see it was to be reminded that the body was meat, and that salvation, if it came at all, came from outside this world. In wealthier cities, plague doctors were granted housing and special legal protections. In some cases, their contracts allowed them to make autopsies, a radical act in a world that often viewed the opening of the human body as desecration. These postmortems, crude as they were, yielded strange findings: descriptions of blackened lungs, swollen livers, cracked bones. Some doctors kept drawings, anatomical sketches more artistic than precise, with tiny notes scrawled in Latin. Others recorded nothing, too exhausted to write, too frightened that ink could not capture what they had seen. But always they left behind traces, a name in a ledger, a comment in a margin, a mark on a door. And still the plague returned. In waves. In new towns. In altered forms. And each time, the doctors came again, some new, some returning, their robes updated, their masks repainted, their herbs rearranged. They came not because they believed they could stop it, but because someone had to watch. Someone had to count. Someone had to stand in the house of the dying and say, "This is how it ends." And when it ended, when the bells rang for healing, they left. No banners, no parades, just footsteps down the cobblestone and the closing of a door. Their disappearance was rarely noted. A quiet departure, often at dawn, leaving behind an empty room and the faint scent of smoke and lavender. Sometimes they left their robes behind, folded carefully in a corner, stiff with dried sweat and wax, too saturated with memory to carry forward. Other times they carried them onward, reusing the same garments in city after city, each layer a tapestry of suffering. There were no monuments to them. No stained glass images of a beaked figure offering comfort, no statues holding staffs or plague lists. And yet, they became icons in their own way. In the margins of illuminated manuscripts, they appeared, small, bird-like, half-comic, half-menacing. In paintings, they haunted the backgrounds, barely visible behind processions of the dead. The image endured, even when the names did not. Centuries later, the plague doctor would become a mask for festivals, a Halloween costume, a symbol adopted by artists, musicians, protesters, and storytellers. But the real men inside those robes were not seeking symbolism. They were not performing for legacy. They were trying, with limited tools and clouded knowledge, to create shape out of catastrophe. They worked in a liminal space where science had not yet taken hold and religion had begun to falter. They leaned on what they had: repetition, observation, ritual, and the strange comfort of layers. Layered clothing, layered scent, layered silence. To be covered was to be safe. To see without being seen was to endure. They lived in constant calculation: how long to stay, when to breathe, which side of a bed to stand on, how many times to wash their hands in water that no longer felt clean. They became observers of small things: the color of a tongue, the feel of a pulse, the shifting weight of a dying man's chest. And they noted the unexplainable, too, the way some people survived when they shouldn't have, the way prayers sometimes seemed to help even when medicine did not, the way a single fresh breeze through a window could change a room. They were not universally somber. Some found dark humor in their work, muttering cynical remarks beneath their masks or nicknaming their patients after saints. Others became solemn beyond recognition, no longer speaking unless spoken to, barely eating, barely sleeping, caught in a loop of recording, tending, leaving. Their emotional survival depended on detachment, but detachment has its own cost. Some wrote, years later, of a numbness that never lifted. Others turned to drink, to isolation, to faith. A few returned to normal practice, barbering, bone setting, midwifery, but they were changed. Their patients could sense it. There was a stillness in them, a heaviness around the eyes, a carefulness that could not be taught. The cities, once emptied, slowly refilled. Markets reopened, churches rang bells not for the dead but for weddings and feast days again. But something remained in the walls, in the thresholds, in the way people looked over their shoulders. The plague doctor had walked there once, his beak full of rosemary, his gloves slick with oil, his staff tapping on stone. His absence did not erase the memory. For decades, generations even, children spoke of him with mingled fear and fascination. "He comes when the air is thick," they whispered. "He listens for coughing." Some believed his staff could point out the sick before they showed symptoms. Others said his breath could kill if you heard it through the beak. These stories were false, but powerful. The doctor had become part of folklore. And in time, the reasons for the plague would become clearer. Rats, fleas, bacteria. Sanitation, trade routes, famine, war. But in the 14th century, those answers did not exist. What did exist was the figure in the mask. Not explaining, not curing, but watching. He stood for a kind of stubbornness. a refusal to look away. He stood at bedsides when priests refused to come. He buried bodies when families fled. He took notes when everyone else collapsed. He was not a miracle. He was presence. In a world gone hollow with loss, that was no small thing. Today, we see the mask in museums, behind glass, lit softly as if to soothe its silhouette. We read about the contracts, the treatments, the failures. We wonder how people could believe in air as the enemy, in herbs as armor, in leather as salvation. But belief, like grief, follows its own logic. The plague doctor was never about perfect science. He was about trying to make order from terror, trying to stand when others had fallen, trying to breathe when the air itself felt cursed. And perhaps, in that effort, he succeeded more than we know. They didn't come with fire, not at first. They came with questions. Soft ones. Casual, even. Had you noticed anyone behaving strangely? Had the milk turned sour more often than usual? Were your hens laying less than they used to? And did you ever hear voices in the night that didn't seem to belong to anyone you knew? They never mentioned witches, not at first. The word hung back, patient, like smoke curling from a damp thatched roof. But even before it was spoken, everyone knew that it had arrived. You could feel it in the silence of neighbors, in the way windows closed quicker, in the way people began looking at one another longer than politeness allowed. And always, beneath it all, was the question that no one wanted to ask. Why did the plague strike here and not there? Why did one child live, while another died before dawn? Why did the priest succumb while the herbalist stayed whole? In the absence of answers, suspicion bloomed. It took root in villages already thinned by grief and watered by fear. And into this uneasy soil stepped the witch hunters, not yet as we picture them, with robes and brimstone, but as men of purpose, of certainty. They came on foot, or sometimes on horseback, cloaked not in power, but in permission. Often, they bore letters from regional lords or whispered blessings from churchmen eager to avoid direct involvement. Their tools were simple at first: questions, lists, inkpots. They asked who had medicine, who had cats, who lived alone, who stared too long at the moon. Their faces were not cruel. Not yet. They were calm, studious, often weary from travel. But their presence changed things. The moment they arrived, stories began to surface, and the past began to reassemble itself around a new kind of logic. Suddenly, old arguments became evidence. A woman who had once cursed a neighbor for trampling her herbs was remembered to have muttered something under her breath the week the neighbor's baby died. A midwife who had delivered too many stillbirths was said to have a strange smell in her house. A man with a crooked back and strange hands, always seen near the fields but never helping, was spoken of with new caution. These were not confessions. They were recollections, reshaped by fear and handed over like offerings. And the witch hunters wrote them down. Carefully. Deliberately. Not to punish, they said, but to understand. Not to condemn, but to protect. The villagers, numb from loss and desperate for meaning, nodded. Anything that could explain the randomness of death felt like a kind of salvation. And so the questions continued. More detailed now. Who kept charms beneath their mattress? Who walked too often in the woods? Who refused communion? The answers poured in, wrapped in anxiety and sealed with desperation. People were not evil, just frightened. They wanted to survive. They wanted the pattern to make sense. And the witch hunters provided that pattern. Slowly, methodically, they stitched together the story that some people had made pacts, had turned away from God, had allowed the sickness to enter. That human hands, not just divine judgment or bad air, had brought the plague to their doorsteps. It was a story with rules, with logic, with villains. And once it took hold, it was hard to let go. The accused were not dragged away screaming. Not yet. They were summoned, gently, asked to explain small things. Why did they own more salt than they could use? Why did their bread rise better than anyone else's? Why did they have a book no one else could read? Most answered honestly. Some laughed. A few grew angry. But the questions kept coming. And the more they answered, the more the story grew. The hunter would nod, and write, and return the next day with another sheet of parchment. Always polite. Always precise. But the village had changed. Neighbors no longer spoke across fences. Children were kept indoors. And the accused, still walking freely, found their steps noticed, their doors watched, their pasts rewritten. No one yet thought it would end in flames. Not yet. The lists were never long at first. 5 names. Maybe 7. Written in neat ink, folded carefully, and handed to the local steward or the parish priest with the kind of solemnity usually reserved for holy relics. They were not arrests. Not yet. Just people to watch. People whose presence had become suspicious, whose habits now seemed out of tune with the rhythm of survival. Sometimes they were women, older, often widowed, with rough hands and strange knowledge of herbs. Sometimes they were men, reclusive, sharp-eyed, poorly spoken. And sometimes they were simply unlucky. A birthmark. A limp. A reputation for being difficult. These were things that never mattered before, but now they made sense. Now they formed patterns. The witch hunters read these lists not as accusations, but as maps. They traced lines between names, between stories, between griefs. This child died after that argument. That cow sickened after that visitor passed. Coincidence turned to structure. It felt scientific. The villagers were told they had a duty to protect the community, to guard their souls, to ensure that the mistakes of other towns were not repeated here. And so they cooperated. Some eagerly, others reluctantly. One by one, more names were added. It didn't take long. The plague had left everyone brittle, and suspicion became a balm. If evil had a name, then it could be named. And if it could be named, perhaps it could be controlled. So the parchment grew heavier, and the air thicker. The accused began to notice. Doors closed quicker. Faces turned away. Bread that had once been shared was now refused. The healer who had once been called for childbirths and fevers now sat alone, her jars of dried leaves untouched. The man who once played flute outside the inn no longer dared whistle. Music, after all, could charm spirits. The witch hunters returned again and again, asking now not just about behavior, but about dreams. Had anyone seen animals speaking? Shadows moving the wrong way? Had they heard laughter in places where no one stood? These were not questions asked out of ridicule. They were asked seriously, methodically. Dreams were treated as evidence. Nightmares were testimonies. People began to second-guess their own thoughts. A girl who had once imagined her dead grandmother tucking her in now feared that memory. A farmer who had once seen a glowing light in the woods now recanted the story he had told so often by the hearth. Memory itself was suspect. The hunter's tools grew more elaborate. Pendulums. Dowsing rods. Collections of saints' bones used to detect lies. They asked for birth dates, astrological signs, even preferred colors. Charts were drawn. Moon phases consulted. A woman born on a Tuesday, left-handed, and fond of cats became a subject of deep interest. It all felt so logical, so exact. The villagers believed they were watching something important, something sacred unfold. They trusted that those who were innocent would be proven so. And those who were guilty, well, hadn't there always been something odd about them? Confessions were not forced, not yet. But they began to appear. One woman admitted to seeing a shadow sit beside her fire at night. Another spoke of hearing voices in the fields. A man confessed to touching a child's wound and watching it heal too fast. These were not confessions of guilt, but of fear. Of having seen something they could not explain, and not knowing what explanation would be safe. The witch hunters listened, nodded, wrote. They rarely reacted. That was part of the fear. Their calm made everything feel official. By now, the list had grown longer than anyone admitted. And the parchment no longer felt clean. The tools came next. Not the cruel ones, not yet, but the ones that carried the illusion of clarity. Scales, to weigh a woman against the Bible. Needles, to prick for marks that didn't bleed. A bowl of water, to float or to sink. These were rituals disguised as tests, ancient gestures repackaged as evidence. The witch hunters explained each method with confidence. The truly guilty, they said, could not bleed from a wound if touched by sacred iron. The truly corrupted would float in blessed water, repelled by purity. These rules made sense only if you didn't look too closely, and most people didn't. They didn't want to. Clarity, even false clarity, was more comforting than chaos. So the villagers gathered to watch. Quietly. Uneasily. They packed themselves into churchyards and barns where the accused were led forward, tired, confused, barefoot. The air smelled of hay and vinegar. Sometimes incense was burned, not to sanctify the space, but to mask the scent of fear. The testing began with words. Recite the Pater Noster backwards. Name the apostles in order. Say your own name 3 times while holding a candle. These were meant to disorient, to unbalance the mind enough that the soul might slip, that the truth might show itself. Some failed because they were nervous. Some because they were old. Some because they did not understand Latin. None of it mattered. Each failure added a line to the record, another thread in the web. And when words failed to convince, they turned to touch. A birthmark behind the knee. A scar on the palm. A mole beneath the collarbone. These were read like scripture, studied like maps. If a spot didn't respond to the needle, if the accused didn't flinch, that was called the witch's mark. Never mind the thickness of calloused skin. Never mind the wear of years. One wince could mean pain. One stillness could mean pact. The bowl test was the most dramatic. A shallow pond. A lake. Or a wooden tub filled to the brim. The accused was bound, lightly, they said, and lowered into the water. If she sank, she was innocent. If she floated, she was guilty. People said prayers either way. Some shouted. Some wept. Some turned away before the verdict. The witch hunters watched. Calmly. Not because they were cruel, but because they believed. That was the terrible part. They believed they were saving lives. Each test they performed, each mark they recorded, each whisper they translated into accusation, they saw it not as punishment, but as purification. To rid the village of a seed of darkness. To reset the balance. And to the crowd watching from behind fences and doorways, that belief was contagious. Those who passed the tests were not freed. Not exactly. They were watched. Labeled. They were never quite welcomed again. Their bread was not eaten. Their children not invited to games. The priest looked at them too long when passing the host. They became living warnings. Shadows still permitted to walk in daylight. And those who failed? They were taken elsewhere. Moved to small rooms in colder buildings. Watched over by guards who were instructed not to speak too kindly, lest they be charmed. And it was here, in the quiet of confinement, that the next stage began, not of testing, but of persuasion. Confession was now the goal. But not just any confession. Not just, yes, I am a witch, but a story. A full one. Who came to you? What did he look like? What did you sign? What did he offer? What did you give? The questions were rhythmic, repeated until memory bent. Those accused began to answer simply to end the questions. They spoke of animals with glowing eyes, of feasts beneath the moon, of dances that felt like dreaming. They gave the hunters what they wanted. Not because it was true, but because it was easier than silence. And each story, no matter how improbable, was accepted. Written down. Added to the archive. Belief, by now, had become a machine, and the machine did not stop. By now, it was no longer about one witch. It was about many. One accusation led to another, one name became 3, 3 became a dozen. Every confession expanded the circle. Every detail, real or imagined, became a link in the growing chain of guilt. A woman said she flew to a Sabbath on a broom. Another claimed she had never seen her, but both were punished. A man admitted to speaking with a black dog. The neighbor who had once fed that same dog was called in for questioning. Stories echoed across towns, shaped by local fears, by weather, by famine. In one village, witches danced on rooftops. In another, they sang backwards while baking bread. The witch hunters didn't invent these images. They collected them, polished them, and handed them back to the people like mirrors. And people, weary and fractured by grief, believed what they saw. It wasn't that they were ignorant. It wasn't stupidity or backwardness. It was pain. They had buried too many children, had watched too many animals waste away, had heard too many priests say, "We do not know." And when knowledge fails, belief steps in, not always kind, not always gentle, but firm. The witch hunters offered firmness. Their books were heavy, their robes dark, their language full of certainty. They quoted scripture, cited ancient scholars, invoked the authority of bishops and kings. And if the accused happened to be poor, isolated, or simply disliked, well, that only proved the power of darkness to target the weak. Torture began quietly, unofficially, hidden behind phrases like persistent questioning and spiritual coercion. It began with cold rooms, with days of fasting, with sleep interrupted by bells and prayers. Then it moved to ropes, to heat, to pressure. The goal was not to cause pain, so they said, but to bring clarity. A soul burdened by guilt, they claimed, must be shaken free. Some confessed everything, anything, in minutes. Others held out longer. But even the strong eventually broke, not always from agony, but from loneliness. The questions never stopped. The eyes never looked away. And the hope that truth might save them faded as it became clear that the truth had already been written. The public trials that followed were slow, formal, and hollow. The charges were read. The confessions, recorded neatly, were recited by scribes. Witnesses were called, neighbors, old friends, reluctant relatives. Some wept. Others stared at the ground. No one shouted. No one pleaded. That part had already happened, behind walls. The accused stood quietly, wearing plain clothes, their hair often cut, their eyes unfocused. When asked if they had anything to say, most did not answer. They had said enough. The verdicts were inevitable. Even acquittal, rare as it was, came with exile. To be called a witch once was to be touched forever. Punishment varied by region. In some towns, the accused were whipped and paraded. In others, they were drowned, hanged, or burned. Burning was rare early on, but growing. Fire was seen as purifying, final, dramatic. It satisfied the crowd. It silenced doubt. The smell of smoke drifted through valleys like a second kind of plague, and the ash, caught on the wind, clung to shutters and clothing for days. People did not speak of it directly. They did not say, "We watched her burn." They said, "It is over now." But nothing was ever really over. Grief lingered. Guilt lingered. The memory of faces turned away and fear lingered, and the witch hunters moved on. They did not stay. They had other villages, other lists, other questions. Their work was not done. There were always more stories to gather, more uncertainty to translate into patterns. They left behind scorched fields of memory and towns where trust had thinned to thread. And the people, those who had nodded and whispered and pointed, were left to sew their days back together in silence. The logic of fear, once planted, never leaves entirely. It waits. It adapts. And in the right season, it blooms again. The church was not always the architect, but it was never far from the frame. It stood behind the witch hunts not with fire in hand, but with books, with silence, and with permission. In some regions, priests resisted, quietly, carefully, refusing to name names, refusing to allow trials inside sanctified walls. But more often, the church offered its weight to the proceedings, not through violence but through structure. The very idea of heresy had long been planted in Christian soil. The fear of false worship, of corrupted prayer, of secret gatherings in woods or cellars, all of it had scriptural precedent. And though witchcraft was often dealt with as superstition, once it was framed as a spiritual crime, the church could not remain absent. It became a matter of souls, not just sickness. The sermons changed. Not overnight, not boldly, but subtly. Warnings about false prophets. Passages about the devil taking many forms. Parables where the wolves in sheep's clothing bore familiar traits: old, unmarried, stubborn. The villagers listened. They trusted their priests, especially after the plague had thinned their numbers. Those who remained were seen as survivors, as chosen. And when those men, tired, haunted, hungry for order, began to speak of purity, of vigilance, of the danger of the unseen enemy within, the people nodded. Not because they were eager to condemn, but because they had run out of explanations. And the church, with its certainty, filled the silence left behind by grief. Some priests joined the witch hunters directly. They served as record keepers, as interpreters of behavior, as moral arbiters. They judged not only what had been done, but what had been intended. A dream was weighed like a deed, a whisper like a wound. They read from manuals written centuries earlier, texts that spoke of demons, of pacts, of signs. Books filled with methods to identify sin, many written by men who had never met a woman outside confession. These texts became the basis for accusation, for confession, for punishment. The Malleus Maleficarum, though later in publication, was preceded by dozens of smaller treatises, pamphlets copied by monks in cold cloisters, passed from diocese to diocese like sacred law. They described the devil's tactics, the marks of witches, the signs of corruption in cattle, in crops, in dreams. These were not fringe documents. They were treated with the gravity of theology. And they shaped the world. Even in towns where the bishop stayed silent, his absence carried weight. To allow the witch hunters to operate unchecked was, in itself, an answer. And the people read the silence as agreement. In monasteries, some monks prayed for the souls of the accused, but few raised voices against the machinery. The hierarchy of the church depended on order, on chain of command, on obedience. To speak out was to risk heresy oneself. So the wheels turned slowly, inexorably, powered by prayers said with trembling certainty. Yet not all clergy stood aside. In some rare corners of the map, lone priests questioned the logic. They pointed out inconsistencies in the testimonies. They refused to allow their churches to be used as courts. A few even hid the accused. These men were not praised. They were watched. Their names, too, ended up on lists, not as witches, perhaps, but as sympathizers. And in a world slipping toward ideological purity, sympathy could be more dangerous than spellcraft. The sacred and the secular became blurred. The line between sin and crime vanished. A woman who failed to attend Mass for 3 weeks was suspected of nocturnal rites. A man who refused to tithe was said to have cursed his neighbor's fields. Guilt became a shape that could be drawn around anyone with the right words and enough witnesses. And the church, ancient and patient, allowed the line to widen. Not because it relished the violence, but because it believed it was defending something older than compassion. It was defending truth. And so, in dim-lit chapels, names were spoken in confession and repeated in court. Prayers were said for the souls of the condemned, even as fires were lit for their bodies. And afterward, the priest stood in doorways and told the frightened that it was over, that the danger had passed, that the devil had been routed, for now. And the people, exhausted, believed them, not because the signs had vanished, but because they needed it to be true. She was usually older, often unmarried, sometimes widowed. Her hands were rough from work, her spine bent not from wickedness but from years spent over looms, over fires, over fields. She lived alone or with children who had long since grown, or died. Her voice was sharp, or her voice was soft, it didn't matter. If she asked too many questions, she was marked. If she kept to herself, she was marked. If she sang while she worked, if she walked at night, if she had a cat, if she had none, it could all be rewritten as evidence. She had no protection. No husband to speak for her. No son to draw a sword. No title, no land, no seal. Only habits. Only memories. Only neighbors with long recollections and short mercy. And so when the accusations came, they came quietly. A murmur outside the bakehouse. A glance at the well. A priest who hesitated before handing her the host. Then the knock at the door. It wasn't always her, of course. But it was mostly women. And mostly women like her. Because the image of the witch, The real witch, the feared one, was shaped not from theology, but from fear of independence. She knew things, they said. About herbs. About the moon. About dreams. She didn't flinch when men raised their voices. She didn't marry. She didn't ask. She didn't smile. She outlived her husband. She buried 4 children. She sang songs no one had heard in church. She came from a place no one visited anymore. She carried herself like someone who had already been broken and rebuilt. And that, more than anything, unsettled the village. Sometimes she was beautiful. And that, too, was dangerous. Because beauty was charm. And charm could bend a man's will. And if a man stumbled, or failed, or desired wrongly, it must have been her fault. And sometimes she was not beautiful. And that, also, was dangerous. Because if she could not be desired, then she must be bitter. Envious. A thief of warmth. Either way, she could not be left alone. She was not what the world wished her to be. And so, she became a witch. Younger women, too, were not safe. If they bled irregularly. If they miscarried. If they gave birth too soon, or not at all. If they loved the wrong person. If they were seen walking alone on a feast day. If they laughed at the wrong moment, or didn't laugh at all. Innocence was not protection. It was expectation. And to fall outside it, even briefly, even without meaning, was to court suspicion. And so girls learned early to watch their hands. Their voices. Their curiosity. They learned to stay small. The witch hunts were not just about evil. They were about control. About reminding women of the shape they were supposed to take. The narrow corridor between silence and usefulness. Between obedience and erasure. The accused were not always guilty of anything but surviving in a way that made others uncomfortable. They owned nothing but stories. And those stories, once turned sideways, became confessions. A neighbor remembered you dancing alone in the snow? That was a ritual. You cried out during childbirth? That was a spell. You once said you hated the bishop's brother? That was a curse. Words twisted, braided, scorched into evidence. And when it came time for punishment, they were told to confess. To name others. To give the devil his due. Some refused. Some gave names. Some said nothing and let the silence fill in the gaps. And when they died, quietly, violently, publicly, they became warnings. To other women. To girls. To anyone who thought of stepping beyond the shape the village had drawn for them. But even in this, there was resistance. Quiet, hidden, stubborn. Women who hid the accused. Who passed food through shutters. Who whispered prayers in secret. Who kept journals. Who remembered names. Who buried ash with dignity. They could not stop the fire. But they could refuse to look away, and that refusal, small as it seemed, mattered. The fires burned out. Eventually. Not because justice prevailed or because minds were changed, but because the ground grew too cold, the wood too scarce, the names too familiar. Entire villages had emptied of their strange, their stubborn, their solitary. The witches were gone. Or at least, no longer named. The witch hunters moved on to new territories, where grief was still fresh and people were still willing to believe that the devil's fingers had touched their doors. In time, even those hunts faded. Not from remorse, but from fatigue. Records were boxed. Trials postponed. A new war, a new drought, a new threat stole the attention of those in power. The machine did not stop, it simply shifted gears. But the memory remained. It lingered in the way mothers warned their daughters not to be too bold. In the way men paused before praising a woman too much. In the way churches kept certain books locked behind doors. It lived in songs that skipped verses. In footpaths avoided after dark. In the shape of stories that began with weather and ended with a woman, always alone, always doomed. The smoke had settled, but the ash had not. It was in the rafters. In the fabric. In the pause before a name was spoken. In the way a child learned not to ask why something happened, only who had made it so. Some towns tried to forget. The names of the accused were struck from registers. Their homes were taken, resold, or collapsed. Their belongings distributed as spoils or burned in pits with the rest of the evidence. In these places, the silence grew thick. Not solemn, but hollow. A silence that did not comfort. That waited. That resented being disturbed. Travelers noticed it. Priests ignored it. Children, born later, were warned never to go near the well after sunset, not because of witches, but because of what the village had done to them. Other places remembered differently. Some wrote names on small stones and placed them near trees. Some kept books with blank pages where the accused would have written their prayers. A few churches carved small crosses near the back pews, one for each soul lost not to the plague, but to the fire. These acts were not loud. They were not proud. But they were there. And they mattered. The descendants of those accused, if they stayed, carried the story in fragments. A great aunt who vanished. A mother's warning to never plant rosemary near the windowsill. A habit of leaving bread on the doorstep during storms. The rational mind dismissed these things, but the heart kept them, tucked beneath layers of newer worries. The witch hunts had not only claimed lives, they had changed the shape of inheritance. Not of wealth, but of memory. And memory, once reshaped, cast long shadows. The witch hunters themselves faded into obscurity. Their names survived in court records, in marginalia, in ledgers that scholars now pore over with cold fingers and furrowed brows. Some were promoted. Some died alone. Some left behind journals in which they expressed no doubt, only fatigue. They had done what they were asked. They had brought order, they believed, to chaos. And like all such men, they vanished into the machinery they had helped turn. But what they left behind was not order. It was fracture. The kind that runs beneath the surface, invisible to the eye, but felt in the foundation. Communities never truly recovered. Trust, once cracked, does not seal cleanly. It dries crooked, leaving seams that catch the light in strange ways. And so the memory of the witch hunts persisted, not in museums or holidays, but in glances, in pauses, in old paths avoided. And still, the wind moved through the trees as it always had. Still, the moon rose. Still, women gathered herbs, and children dreamed of lights in the forest. And the world turned quietly, forgetting, then remembering, then forgetting again. It didn't stop all at once. No proclamation, no sudden voice from the pulpit declaring the end. The unraveling of the witch hunts came the same way they had begun, quietly, and for reasons no one admitted aloud. Trials still occurred, but fewer. Accusations still surfaced, but they were harder to pursue. The same parchment, the same ink, the same whispering suspicions persisted, but something had changed. A weariness had settled in, not just among the accused, but among the accusers. Too many had died. Too many names had been spoken and then regretted. Too many neighbors had vanished, leaving behind not evil, but silence. And silence, after a while, became difficult to justify. Some towns had lost nearly everyone. Not to plague, but to process. Not to natural disaster, but to belief. Fields lay untended. Bread grew scarce. Children wandered through alleys where laughter no longer lived. The cost had become visible, not just spiritual, but practical. And in that emptiness, questions began to stir. Not bold questions. Not yet. But hesitant ones, offered in safe corners, behind drawn curtains. What if that woman had only spoken too freely? What if the child had only been sick from cold water? What if the devil hadn't visited at all? Clerics who had once condemned now chose different passages. Sermons turned again to patience, to forgiveness, to humility. Scholars began to argue in low tones that perhaps not every confession should have been believed. Local judges, burdened with too many cases, began delaying trials. Some simply declined to hear new accusations, citing lack of witnesses, lack of clarity, lack of strength. A few even apologized, though quietly, and only to themselves. But more than anything else, time began to soften the sharpest edges. The memories that had once cut through households grew dull with repetition. The woman once called a witch was remembered, instead, as someone who made good broth. The man once blamed for bad weather became, again, a farmer with sad eyes. People stopped naming their children after the saints involved in trials. They named them after grandparents instead. The past began to return, piece by piece, reshaped, rearranged, but reclaimed. And in that rearranging, stories shifted. What had once been called a curse became a coincidence. What had once been a pact became a misunderstanding. The world did not suddenly become wise, but it became tired. And from that tiredness, a kind of mercy was born, not loud, not proud, but steady. Fewer names were added to lists. The ink dried faster. The hunters, finding less work, turned to other roles. Some became tax collectors. Others vanished into the bureaucracy they had once worked around. And the fires finally stayed unlit, but memory, even softened, never vanished. It was not the courts or the priests who began to pull the narrative apart, but the scholars, quiet men and women with ink-stained fingers and rooms filled with dust. They were not heroes. They were not even particularly brave. But they were patient. And they asked the kinds of questions that did not make sense to ask in the height of panic, but now, in the calm after fire, could be spoken aloud. What exactly did that confession mean? What language was it recorded in? Who transcribed it, and under whose direction? What was the legal process? Had there been one? What was the evidence? Who had benefited? These were not accusations. They were studies. Treatises. Notes passed between universities, sometimes anonymously. Slowly, bit by bit, they peeled back the ritual of the witch trial and laid bare its machinery. They found inconsistencies, contradictions, recycled testimony used across towns, descriptions of devils that echoed the drawings of misunderstood illnesses, legal structures that collapsed under close inspection. And from those findings came questions of ethics, of justice, of process. Not shouted, not paraded, but written, printed, circulated in slow waves, and the students read them. Young minds, raised on the edge of old beliefs, began to see the cracks. They did not immediately rise up or storm the churches, but they paused before echoing the fears of their elders. They asked more questions. They waited before believing. And in that waiting, the momentum slowed further. What began as a moral certainty was now treated as historical error. What had once been sacred evidence was now studied as cultural artifact. The witch became not a threat, but a symbol, of fear, of grief, of misdirected justice. Her figure shifted in literature, in painting, in song. She became the misunderstood, the tragic, even the wise. Artists painted her not burning, but healing. Writers imagined her not cursing, but teaching. And while the past could not be rewritten, its shape began to change. This was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start. A shift. An opening. In time, laws changed. Slowly. Hesitantly. Witchcraft, once a crime punishable by death, became a relic in legal books, still there, but without enforcement. Judges cited reason, not fear. Towns moved on. Not toward enlightenment, exactly, but toward exhaustion with persecution. And that exhaustion was enough to grant space. Space for silence. Space for forgetting. Space, even, for remembering differently. And in the margins of books once filled with judgments, new notes were written. In softer hands. With different ink. The world did not end with the witch hunts, though for many, it might as well have. Villages rebuilt. Bells rang again. Markets reopened. Children grew into new generations who had only heard stories, half remembered, half feared, about a time when neighbors could vanish with only a whisper. Fields returned to green. Roads, once empty, filled again with carts, with pilgrims, with gossip. And in this resumed world, life returned not triumphantly, but cautiously. People learned to speak carefully, to trust slowly, to avoid the kinds of questions that had once lit fires. But beneath it all, something remained. Not ghosts, not curses, but residue. A kind of quiet embedded deep in the grain of wood, in the foundations of churches, in the soil around wells and gallows. Places remembered. Not consciously, not through plaque or monument, but through mood. There were corners where laughter never quite returned. Rooms where the air always felt slightly colder. Traditions that shifted without clear reason, like why bread was broken a certain way, or why rosemary grew at the edge of every garden. Small resistances. Small remembrances. In some places, a woman still places salt on the doorstep after a stranger passes. Not because she believes, but because her grandmother did. In others, a child is told not to stare too long at the moon, not because it's dangerous, but because it's rude. These rituals, softened by time, carry the shape of a history that could not fully be named. The memory of the witch, the hunter, the crowd, it lives not as a story often told, but as a caution woven into daily rhythm. Do not speak too freely. Do not stand too tall. Do not forget what silence can cost. Yet in that same soil, something else grows. Understanding. The kind that doesn't arrive with torches or sermons, but with time, with reflection, with questions asked gently. Artists now paint the accused not as villains, but as healers, as midwives, as lonely souls who dared to live slightly outside the line. Musicians write songs that remember, not to glorify the pain, but to give it shape. And historians walk the same footpaths where once the condemned were led, and they pause. Not just to record but to respect. There is no redemption for what was done. No justice that can balance the scales. But there is this, a world that remembers more than it punishes. A world that, in its quietest corners, still carries the echo of voices once silenced. And when the wind passes through the trees on a still afternoon, it does not speak. But it remembers. The castles were quiet, not with the silence of mourning, but with the hush of insulation. Thick stone walls muffled the sound of bells from distant villages, heavy wooden doors creaked only when summoned by gloved hands, and the voices of servants lowered themselves instinctively, even when speaking of simple things, bread, water, the inventory of wine. Inside, life continued, but in a suspended state, preserved like figs in honey, untouched by the plague's outward chaos but deeply aware of its presence just beyond the iron gates. The noble families who retreated into their estates during the Black Death were not fleeing as cowards, nor remaining as conquerors. They were pausing, hiding within a framework of wealth that had always offered distance, but now offered survival. They brought with them their stewards, their cooks, their private confessors and physicians, their books of hours with gilded margins, their prayer beads worn smooth from repetition. They lit candles not just for worship, but for reassurance. And while the world outside choked on smoke and fever, inside the halls of these estates, a different kind of tension grew, not of infection, but of waiting. Bread was the anchor of the rich, as it was for the poor, but the loaves were softer, made from finer flour, stored in warmer rooms. Each morning, the kitchens were instructed to produce not abundance, but regularity, predictable meals at predictable hours, as though the body, when fed with rhythm, might forget that the sky was changing. Bread with cheese, bread with salt pork, bread toasted and soaked in milk and spices. It was less about hunger and more about control. Food as routine. Wine, too, flowed more freely than outside, not in celebration, but in habit. A glass at noon, a larger one at dusk, something warm to pour over fear. Servants, masked or unmasked depending on household custom, passed through corridors like ghosts, speaking only when addressed, carrying linen, sweeping dust that never seemed to settle. The fires were kept small, not for lack of wood but to keep the rooms from growing too close, too heavy with thought. And always, from some corner, the sound of prayer, muttered Latin, pages turning, the faint rattle of beads as fingers moved slowly over ancient verses. Doctors in these households were chosen carefully. Some were scholars, others simply confident. They examined not corpses, but pulses. They prescribed theriac, prepared poultices of rose and ash, and warned against melancholy. More than medicine, they provided presence. A man in black robes with steady hands, an authority who whispered reassurance even when he had no cure. Their greatest tool was calm. The lady of the house would call for wine and rosemary oil, The Lord would inquire about the astrology charts. The children would be told stories of saints who survived plagues by faith alone. In this enclosed world, news came slowly and was filtered, carried by messengers on horseback, written in carefully worded letters, summarized by scribes who avoided alarming language. The neighboring town has closed its gates. The monastery has ceased daily service. There will be no summer fair this year. But no one said the words aloud. No one said death had climbed the hill. These households were not untouched by fear, only well practiced in masking it. Curtains were drawn in rooms that faced the road. Boots were washed with wine before entering. Servants who coughed were quietly replaced. Mail was burned or aired before reading. Some families refused outside contact altogether, living months without seeing another face, as if exile were nobility. Others allowed carefully regulated visits from other noble families, dinners held in halls with long tables, guests seated far apart, voices echoing in the stone like distant song. Politeness remained, as did rank. Titles still mattered. Gloves were kissed. But always, just beneath the surface, was the calculation: who had been exposed, who had been in the city, who had heard what rumor. Gossip became currency. Not the playful scandal of court, but the soft weapon of speculation. Who had fled early, who had not locked their gates fast enough, who had ordered more salt than usual. Every detail became a whisper. Time moved differently inside the manor. Without markets or festivals to mark the weeks, the calendar dissolved. The only structure came from the rituals of the church, the daily prayers, the saints' days, the morning psalms sung in the chapel even if the priest stood alone. And in between, letters were written. Long letters to cousins, to business partners, to bishops, to no one in particular. Letters that chronicled meals, weather, dreams, the color of the evening sky. Not because the content mattered, but because the act of writing said, "I am still here. I am still thinking." The ink became an echo of presence. In some houses, the ladies kept journals, not of events but of thoughts. They sketched the garden through the window, recorded the shape of a dream, the sudden memory of a scent. Some wrote down the names of the dead, not those they knew, but those they imagined had no one to remember them. In this way, the nobility maintained their distance from the world while quietly mourning it. The protection of the body may have come in the form of bread and distance, but the protection of the soul required more elaborate measures. Among the noble class, survival was never just about flesh. It was about salvation, about being seen as righteous in the eyes of God even while the world darkened. In the quiet of their halls, they opened their books of hours, manuscripts bound in velvet or leather, pages edged with gold, script neat and rounded, adorned with tiny illustrations of saints, angels, suffering, and hope. Each page was a map of ritual. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, each prayer an anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The flickering candlelight reflected off the gilded borders, casting warm glows over margins where birds and vines danced around solemn Latin phrases. These books were more than devotional tools. They were artifacts of identity, proof of piety, personalized shields against what could not be explained. A noblewoman might keep her book close even in sleep, pressing it to her chest as if it could catch dreams before they turned into visions. A young lord might write his name in the back, followed by the names of those he feared might never return. They prayed not only in Latin but in silence. Whole mornings passed in quiet contemplation, not of theological nuance but of memory, faces last seen months before, voices dimmed by distance. The chapels inside the estates, though small, were ornate. Stone floors scrubbed clean with vinegar, pews draped with linen, crosses polished until they caught even the smallest flame. Some households commissioned new altarpieces during the plague, not images of triumphant saints, but of suffering ones. Saint Sebastian riddled with arrows, Saint Roch lifting his tunic to reveal the plague mark, the Virgin weeping quietly in the corner. Art became a mirror for fear, a way to turn inward while pretending to look beyond. And priests, those who remained healthy enough to travel or had already taken refuge with their noble patrons, served Mass with a strange mix of weariness and resolve. They read the Gospel over half-empty rooms, their voices echoing more than usual, as though speaking both to the living and those already drifting away in thought. Confession became more frequent. Not the whispered kind shared in dark corners of city cathedrals, but the slow, deliberate kind conducted in drawing rooms, between sips of wine and bowls of broth. Lords confessed sins they had never before considered: pride, waste, detachment. Ladies confessed the thoughts of running, of locking their children in rooms just in case. The confessor listened, nodded, reminded them of divine mercy, and prescribed prayers as penance. The rosaries passed between fingers more often than ever. Some were carved of bone, others of jet, some set with semi-precious stones. They clicked softly in the dark, like distant rain on roof tiles. To the outside world, these acts may have seemed hollow, performative, luxurious. But to those within, they were deeply personal, acts of survival in a form the plague could not touch. There were relics too. Every noble household had them, tucked into ornate boxes lined with silk. A shard of wood said to be from the true cross. A strip of cloth once worn by a saint. A finger bone, a splintered tooth, a bead of dried blood encased in crystal. These objects were carried between rooms, placed beneath pillows, held in trembling hands during storms or when someone coughed more than once. The line between faith and superstition was blurred, and no one bothered to untangle it. When the soul trembles, reason often retreats. And so the relics stayed close, kissed reverently, guarded more fiercely than ledgers or gold. They were not merely reminders of divine power, they were extensions of it. A nobleman might fall asleep with a relic at his throat, convinced it would prevent the fever from settling in his chest. And if he survived the night, he gave thanks to the fragment, not the fire or the cook or the sealed walls. The belief in omens also flourished, even in these cultivated halls. Birds flying too low. Dogs howling at midday. Dreams of black rivers or white animals. Servants were watched for signs: if the cook forgot salt, if the steward tripped on the stairs, if a mirror cracked. These were read like scripture, interpreted over dinner as seriously as political news. And there were other, more private rituals. Some families refused to speak the word plague aloud. Others placed iron nails beneath thresholds or drew chalk lines across window sills. One baroness was said to have bathed in wine every Friday at sunset, while reciting Psalm 91 from memory. Whether it worked or not, she lived. And that was enough. The sense of divine judgment was everywhere, though spoken differently depending on the household. For some, the plague was punishment for the sins of the lower classes, for rebellion, gluttony, or irreverence. For others, it was a test sent to the good to strengthen their resolve. And for many, it was simply a mystery, unchosen, unfair, unrelenting. But all agreed on one thing: God was watching. And in being watched, one must behave. So the rich behaved. They prayed more. They swore less. They washed their hands not just with soap but with intent. They gave alms, quietly. They spoke of mercy. And they waited. Not with joy, not with fear, but with solemn expectation. That if the walls held, and the prayers held, and the relics remained warm, they might see another spring. While prayer protected the soul and walls protected the body, it was parchment that protected the future. In times of plague, death came quickly, and though the nobles had land and titles, they also had doubts. The uncertainty of life turned their thoughts not just to heaven, but to legacy. And so, behind the heavy doors of their chambers, by candlelight and under the watchful eye of household scribes, they wrote. Wills were updated, often more than once a month. Lineage was recorded, possessions were catalogued, and succession plans were reconsidered with the quiet panic of those who feared their name might end with a fever. Notaries arrived, hooded and gloved, carrying ink and seals and the solemn gravity of legality. Their hands shook from fatigue or fear, but their words were precise. A vineyard to the second son, a reliquary to the daughter at the convent, 3 oxen to the abbey, debts forgiven to a former steward now thought dead. These documents were not only about wealth, they were about control, about shaping the world one might soon leave behind. Inheritance was not a casual matter. With the plague decimating entire bloodlines, the question of who would own what became more urgent than ever. titles hung by a thread. Marriages were arranged swiftly, often between families that would never have considered alliance before. A minor barony could be absorbed by a wealthier cousin with the right paperwork. A misfiled record could lead to disputes lasting decades. The lawyers knew this, and they became powerful in ways they had never imagined. No longer mere advisors, they became the gatekeepers of continuity. They stored documents in wax bundles, organized by region and bloodline. They consulted old charters, dug up forgotten decrees, quoted papal rulings on property held in spiritual trust. Their pens were sharper than swords. In some households, they were feared more than physicians. These legal precautions extended beyond land. Servants were required to sign oaths of loyalty. Some were promised future freedoms in writing, promises few believed would be kept. Others were granted temporary authority, given the right to speak for the household if the master fell ill. Young heirs were assigned guardians, their names entered into ledgers alongside estimated ages and the condition of their education. A daughter might be designated to a convent by ink alone, her future narrowed to stone walls and candlelight before she had ever seen a crucifix. These decisions were rarely questioned. There was no time. The law moved faster than love. Lawyers also played a strange spiritual role. They were not clergy, but their presence marked a kind of confession. To declare one's assets, to divide them among the living, was to admit that death was near. In this way, the legal process mirrored the religious. The confession of property became an act of preparation. Some nobles even chose to be buried with a copy of their will, as if to prove, in the next life, that they had left the world in order. Others had theirs read aloud at dinner, so there would be no confusion. One lord requested his will be carved into the walls of his estate's chapel. It remains there, faded but legible, a testament not only to fear, but to faith and permanence. Yet even with the best planning, nothing was guaranteed. Entire lineages ended in silence, despite the documents. Houses passed to distant relatives who barely remembered the family crest. Legal disputes dragged on long after the last cough had faded from memory. Land was seized by opportunistic neighbors. Coins intended for orphaned heirs vanished into the hands of those who survived with stronger stomachs. And in some cases, all the parchment in the world could not hold back the weight of vacancy. A castle without laughter, a manor without footfall, a name without voice. These, no lawyer could defend. And still, they wrote. The scribes inked names with care, the notaries pressed wax seals with weary palms, the lords signed slowly, often twice, just in case the first was not enough. The act of writing became an act of will, of resistance. A way to say, I may vanish, but this paper, this signature, this record, this will remain. Perhaps that was always the point. Not to be remembered in warmth or glory, but simply to be remembered at all. The walls had held for a time. Heavy, ancient, built to withstand siege and storm, the stone fortresses of the nobility stood proudly above the mist of the valleys, their banners unmoving in the still air of uncertainty. Within them, fire crackled in hearths twice the height of a man, and silver dishes clinked softly on oaken tables as familiar rituals repeated themselves in slow, reassuring rhythm. Bread was baked, psalms were sung, ledgers were reviewed, and the illusion of order was carefully preserved behind every drawn curtain. But time does not ask permission, and the weight of waiting grows heavier than siege. The ivy, once ornamental, began to stretch beyond its carving lines. The corridors echoed too long after footsteps. The servants, fewer each week, began to whisper when no one was looking. Absence has its own sound, and it was beginning to resonate through halls once filled with ceremony. It began with the smallest shifts. The physician no longer sat at the table, citing fatigue. The steward started locking the pantry at night, though none would steal. The chapel's candles burned out sooner, their wax thinner, their flames uncertain. One morning, the laundry was not brought in. Another day, the water jug stood half-filled. The cook, once precise with salt and timing, served a meal underdone. The master did not comment. The lady did not look up. The children no longer played near the windows. And yet, still, no one said it aloud. The household continued as if these gaps were simply the weather, something to be waited out, something not to be named. Naming, after all, had power. And naming meant the world beyond the gates had breached their refuge. The letters that arrived, when they did, carried fewer greetings and more inventories. Who had died, who had remarried, who had fled their lands and taken up residence in abandoned towers, claiming new titles as easily as they claimed dry bread. Some were written in different hands, scribes replacing scribes. Some came sealed with wax from families now technically extinct, the news written in meticulous script by lawyers with no one left to pay them. The ink began to fade quicker than before. Or perhaps it only felt that way. The words swam in the minds of those who read them, not because they were unclear, but because memory itself had begun to soften. What had once been a solid lineage, a tree with deep roots, now felt like dried ivy pulled from stone, brittle, curling, still shaped like life but no longer living. The priests grew quiet. Their sermons, once lofty, filled with metaphors of fire and mercy, became simple, reduced to brief prayers for those absent, for those dying elsewhere, for the unknown number who would never receive their rights. In private, the nobles began to question not only salvation but structure, what it meant to rule when no one remained to be ruled, what it meant to own land no longer worked, to hold a title spoken aloud by fewer voices each year. Some turned to new rituals. A baroness took to walking the halls barefoot before sunrise, pausing before every family portrait, murmuring old names like a litany. A widowed duke kept a fire burning in an unused guest room for months, insisting it be swept daily, as though someone might arrive unannounced and in need of warmth. These actions were not discussed. They were allowed, accepted, woven into the rhythm of retreat. But the retreat itself could not continue forever. What had begun as refuge became a kind of gilded stagnation. The wine ran low. The parchment grew scarce. Ink was thinned with water. Horses died of old age and were not replaced. The music stopped, not all at once, but gradually. A broken lute string. A missing page from a songbook. A singer who lost her voice from cough and never found it again. Even the clocks, ornate water clocks, elaborate sundials, began to lose track. Time inside the estate became unmoored from time outside. One season slipped into the next without harvest or celebration. The scent of lavender no longer masked the mold growing beneath tapestries. And still, the doors remained closed. Until one day, they did not. The decision to open them was never written, never declared. It came slowly, like thaw. A gate left unlatched. A visitor allowed through without being scoured in vinegar. A cousin, long thought dead, arriving with tales of a monastery overgrown but still echoing with bells. And with that small breach came the realization that the walls had not kept the world out. They had only kept the residents in. Life had continued beyond the manor. Change, broken in places, yes, but continued. Markets reopened. Fields were reclaimed by those strong enough to return. Children laughed in alleyways again. Bells rang, not for morning, but for morning. And so, the lords and ladies of the high halls emerged, pale in the sunlight, blinking at the brightness of spring, dressed still in the fabrics of another era. They were not greeted with parades. No one had waited for them. But neither were they rejected. They re-entered a world that had forgotten their names but remembered their hunger. And in doing so, they learned that history does not pause for preservation. It moves forward, even through grief. The estates, once so full of whispered preservation, became something quieter still. Some were abandoned, others repurposed. A dining hall turned into a granary. A library opened to traveling monks. The chapel walls, once heavy with incense and prayer, now smelled of damp stone and clover. But here and there, signs remained, tattered banners, initials etched in pews, the fragile pages of a prayer book left open beneath a beam of dusty light. And in those forgotten corners, the story of the plague was not one of death alone, but of the ways in which people tried to endure it, with walls, with rituals, with ink, with silence. Because in the end, nothing holds forever. Not stone, not parchment, not bloodline. But the effort to hold, the attempt to remember, the reaching out through gold-leaf prayers and sealed letters. that remains. It remains in the archives, in the ruins, in the faint scent of rosewater still soaked into floorboards. The plague came. It changed everything. And when it left, it did not ask what had been saved. It simply moved on. And so did they.